good afternoon. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We thought this would be the best way to address the many questions that have come up in the wake of the arrest at East Towne Mall last night. Chief Koval will explain to you what he can and take questions afterwards. Chief?
Thank you. And thank you for all for being here. Last night, following the council meeting, on my way home, and it was at that time that my phone started blowing up. And I heard from constituents far and wide from around the city, and all urging me at my earliest beckoning call to be able to find a link to YouTube and take a look at what it reflected. And they thought it was very, very difficult to view. And I can understand to some extent why they would have felt that way based on what was seen as a participle of a very long narrative that occurred. So, as soon as I got home, turned around immediately and had an opportunity to meet with some alders, with Michael Johnson of the Boys and Girls Club, who was in the company of an aunt and some other close family members. And together we went in the Chief's conference room and we talked for probably well over an hour or so, or thereabouts. It's all right. And obviously they were moved to tears, to anger, the entire gauntlet of emotions that one could predictably expect when you've seen someone you care for, someone you love, someone who's close to you, at the hands of what looks like a very one-sided transaction. Okay? There are processes that have to be driven and things that have to be explained, and I can't get too far into the woods except to provide some sense of a holistic context, because obviously there is an independent criminal path that must be drawn, as well as an administrative review for the officers that were involved that has to take place in sort of parallel universes. So, with all that in mind, around the supper hour yesterday, we get a call to East Towne Mall, and it's a call that creates a little bit of compelling urgency because we have reports of a woman who's disturbing in the food court, a very public place. People are alarmed. One of the adjectives used, I believe, was out of control. And based on knowing how many people would be in the food court at that time of day for dining, that clearly created a sense of urgency and alacrity for the officers. Ultimately, what apparently occurred, as best we can see from the witnesses that have been contacted thus far, is there was a supposition that someone's cell phone had been ripped off. And the arrested party in this instance, Janelle Laird, believed that there was an employee working at one of the fast food operations who was complicit in that theft and wanted to reclaim it. So in the course of sort of taking those matters into her own hand, it led to a very animated verbal encounter with the counter help, with the affected employee. Other employees were involved, and there were threats, and there was inferences of to kill someone, and ultimately to the employee that she thought had the phone, she even indicated that she had a knife and was willing to stab someone, and there was a flash of that knife being displayed to that individual employee. That, of course, also got the manager of the food court to give a call to the security that is there, private security for the mall at East Towne, who came to intervene, and according to the reports that we have, is that they then encountered a still highly animated, highly agitated, very angry woman who then subsequently began to threaten them as well, at which point their efforts to remove her from the property, coupled with the threats that they've been given, prompted the call to the 911 center. Okay? So upon arrival, one officer got there slightly before the other. When it was clear that the threats had been made and that there was a probable cause to believe that she had created a disturbance on several fronts, and because she had made both an indirect reference as well as having displayed a weapon, the charge moving at that point was disorderly conduct while armed. And if things had gone according to Hoyle at that point, and she had gone with the program and surrendered her liberty at that point at the officer's request, none of the other things that would have occurred would have been transpiring. It was but for the opportunity to make decisions at critical crossroads here that leads to what is obviously a spiraling series of events that occurred thereafter. Now, our officers are trained according to state guidelines for the use of force. There's a pre-certified curriculum known as DAT, D-A-A-T, Defense and Arrest Tactics. Everyone in the state is trained on this curriculum. Everybody is tested on this curriculum. Everyone has to revisit those certifications periodically in order to maintain your proficiency in this curriculum. I have today with me to answer some of the questions that may arise one of our master trainers for Dane County, Officer Chris Masterson, who will demonstrate some of the things that might be helpful for citizens that don't have the sort of trained perspective that we might have in some of our nomenclature and some of our techniques, if you will. Okay? So, at the end of the day, when she resisted the attempts to put under custody, that's where we sort of began this downward turn. Despite repeated attempts that were verbally intoned and directed for her to stop resisting, to put her hands behind her back, in fact, that wasn't occurring. She was non-compliant. The officer found himself in a difficult position in trying to get her hands behind her back, wasn't able to access his shoulder epaulette mic, and literally had to index it with his quarter of his chin to get out the fact that he was struggling and that he needed more help. So more help did arrive, and obviously when you have a crowd gathering, some people are yes people, some people are no people, some people are maybe people, depending on their attitudes towards the police and what's going on. And so the determination was made to do an extraction, get her outside the mall and into a squad car for transport for her original charge. In the course of all of these events, suffice to say is that the officers were threatened with being bitten. They were actually kicked. They were actually scratched. One was spit in the eye, and subsequently that officer was seen and treated for a threshold determination of whether he had received a significant exposure at a local ER. Okay. The other officer, at the conclusion of this, was also transported to a local hospital. He developed some back spasms, and he's on workers' comp for the next few days. All right. In the course of making her arrest finally happen, as you see, it went from bad to worse in terms of her unwillingness to simply surrender her liberty, put her hands behind her back, allow her wrist to be handcuffed and put in the back seat of a squad car. I think that the decentralization which went to the floor and subsequently those strenuous back and forth between the officers as well as her, those will be the issues that will ultimately be evaluated by administrative review and ultimately determine whether the officers in fact use the appropriate use of force consistent with state guidelines. When you have a narrative that lasts 15 minutes or thereabouts, and then you take a slice or a snapshot of that picture, I think you do lose some predicate, you do lose some context in terms of the evolution, or in this case the devolution of what happened from the point of onset to the point where the officers were finally able to secure her, put her in handcuffs, and whisk her away from East Towne Mall. As context is important, we put up just this last quarter our quarterly use of force review. Plan to do that all the time now on a quarterly basis. This department goes on over 15,000 calls on the average every month. Officers and citizens interacting. If you look at the last quarter, our use of force, recordable use of force, where we go hands-on and you see any kind of takedown or physical restraint, that amounted to 0.0025 of 1%. our engagements are characterized overwhelmingly as peaceful, not eventful. Typically, we can resolve most of our issues merely by our presence, our professional communication, our capacity for diffusing and critical thinking, and quite frankly, our capacity to disengage where it's appropriate and tactically appropriate to do that. So this is one of those moments that we are at as a community yet again. Is this a moment in time, one that obviously we have to reflect upon and evaluate and take the proper course, or will this be Madison's defining moment? I'd like to believe it's the former and not the latter, based on our track record, if you will. Of course, as we look at the images of this young woman, one of the first things I remarked to the family, I came here, we met with a select group of alders who also responded, Michael Johnson, and I said to a couple of family members, and again expressed remorse that they had to see their loved ones subjected to this. I also said, let me check on and inquire, because they were worried about her medical needs or any attention that had been offered at the scene or otherwise. She was seen and treated by the Madison Fire Department shortly after the arrest. She was subsequently given a secondary screening at a local hospital, treated and released with no objections. And then subsequently the jail routinely does an intake and a medical assessment for a new prisoner that's going into their establishment. And there too, when asked hurt or injured or any special needs, declined, and there was nothing remarkable noted save for she did receive a little ointment for a cut, is what I'm told from the officer in charge over at the Sheriff's Department. So, process-wise, there are burdens of proof that must be met, elements of each and every crime. It's not untoward that the elements of certain crime or crimes going into an intake door are necessarily the final conclusory crimes that are going to be ultimately adjudicated or considered for referral and prosecution. That is clearly within the purview of the district attorney's office. I have certainly had a conversation with him, and I have said, you know, if everything the family tells me is correct, and this woman had no previous criminal record, this could be just a completely bad day at the office, in which case one thing's staircased into yet another. The MPD isn't interested in extracting some measure of punishment. That's not who we're about. We will be happy to work in collaboration with the DA's office to find what's the most defensible, what's the greatest form of justice that can be derived, and looking towards restorative justice elements if that's appropriate and if she is eligible for that. We would support that. Our job, though, is that at the end of the day, when called to deal with a behavior, if an articulated basis for that behavior rises to the level of a crime for which we have probable cause to believe that that crime was committed and this person committed that crime, it is our obligation to restore order. That's what we do. And there are other elements or complementary players to the criminal justice system who will ultimately determine down the road what is the appropriate outcome. Someone who's booked into the jail is a far hoot and holler cry away from someone who's been convicted of anything. Of anything. That's a booking decision that's made for a referral to the district attorney's office. So we're all going to have to wait and defer and understand that the district attorney's office has prosecutorial discretion to look at the totality of those circumstances involved, at the life that is so affected, the one that has violated a law today, and determine what, if any, of those charges that were initially proffered are still appropriate in the light of day upon further review. That's not our call. But at the time, when you theoretically, allegedly, we say, spit in the eye of a police officer, that's a felony. When you resist arrest and you cause soft tissue injury to an officer, that's a felony. These are crimes that are on the books and were not unique to last night. Interestingly enough, I don't know if there's another new sort of normal, but last night there were literally 3 separate instances occurring throughout our city last night where battery to a police officer was charged on 3 separate individuals. I made 4 calls last night in toto to officers who were injured as a result of doing their statutorily lawful duties that they're constrained to do. So, process standpoint, we've talked a little bit about the defendant's role. That's in the hands of the defense attorney, of course, of the prosecutor. I am certain that she will have an attorney retained, both for her criminal matters as well as, I speculate, a civil action against the city. And those are the checks and balances that keep the police accountable in this system that we run. And we understand that. That's something that we all come to understand when we take this oath of office in a very challenging profession. As far as the officers are concerned, as I said, as a result of the fact that this became such a high-profile matter, literally the 911 center has received threats on the officers' lives. So today I will be deferring. I will not be releasing those officers' names for the time being in order to try to provide a little bit of a sanctuary and a cooling off period, hopefully. And as a matter of course, because like any use of force which is reviewed for its sufficiency and its adequacy and whether it meets the legal standards both within the department as well as the state standards, what we will ultimately be doing is I contact Sheriff Dave Mahoney and I asked him if, given the high-profile nature of this and in my desire to try to do everything I can to redouble our efforts to rekindle whatever trust may have been disrupted as a result of an incident like this, I asked him if he would also provide a resource to basically oversee the work of our administrative reviews so that there'd be an independent set of eyes and ears who could come to a different conclusion if that was their prerogative in looking at those same set of facts. And Sheriff Mahoney has graciously agreed to that, so that we will not have a product here that is ultimately the exclusive domain of the city of Madison and its internal review process. There will be that layer, if you will. I do think that there were some things that, from a standpoint of knowledge base, create some concern. So, Chris, where are you now? Yes. One of the things that, and I'm not a Facebook guy, people tell me that there was a running thing about why did somebody look like they apparently hooded this woman on her transport. We have a specific tool that's obviously been sanctioned and approved. It's called a spit hood, and where an officer has been spat upon or the attempt has been made to do so, this goes very loosely over the entire head. It's a breathable fabric, and that is just done as a precautionary measure. So to those extent where you might have had or seen some rhetoric of some sort of a pillowcase, or I saw in one case someone mentioned that they put a plastic bag over her head, that's clearly erroneous. The other thing that I think gives a lot of people a sense of wanting to know more is the use of, well, we call them electronic control devices, ECD, for all intent and purposes. Taser has become Coca-Cola and Kleenex because it's a Taser product. They have 99% of the market share. But with the use of the Taser, it's a unique instrument. I think some people think, erroneously, that this is a one-size-fits-all. You push a button and it practically gift wraps a combative subject and gets them ready to go to jail. Quite frankly, if anybody wants to look at last year's 1,100 deployments by the LAPD of their Taser, they're a heavy user, only 53% of the time did the Taser actually effectively do what it was supposed to do. And one of the reasons are the constructs of what the engineering provides, or in some cases won't provide. So, Chris, if you wouldn't mind just giving them a basic understanding of the sort of the electricity that's involved, a basic rudimentary explanation.
So the way the taser works is inside of this cartridge, it's the same or analogous to a bullet, 2 darts will come out with wire attached to the end. Both darts have to go out and make contact with an individual, be with about an inch of their actual skin. Electricity will go through those 2 darts, affecting all the muscles in between where the darts are actually touching the skin. So anything in between those 2 will have electricity running through the muscles, and it causes what we call neuromuscular incapacitation. So that means it's basically the same thing as your muscle flexing and releasing 19 times a second. That's essentially what it does. So in order for a taser to work, both probes have to hit. If only one probe hits, it'll actually be ineffective. It'll cause some slight pain, but most of the time it won't do anything to a subject. The way officers are taught to fix it, and what you may see in the video, is the officer deployed the ECD from very close distance. So we'd think it'd be a high probability that both darts would go in. One dart, only one dart hit the subject. The other one actually went into the purse or a bag of some sort. So because of that, the officer can complete the circuit with 2 different points of contact, one being the probe in the subject and one being the actual ECD, this portion being connected to their leg. So there's now 2 points of contact, so everything from where the ECD or taser touches the leg to where that dart goes, the muscles will all be locked up.
So if you see a repeated use of, I think someone said to the ankle or the foot region, that was being to complete the circuitry in order to make it actually operate.
Yep, correct.
Okay. Again, from a very rudimentary standpoint, the objectives of an officer on any call is, number 1, officer and community safety. You're in a very public place where, in this instance, there had been several people threatened, inferentially that there was a knife, with words, "I'm going to stab you," and then subsequently a knife was displayed to one of the victims in this incident. So you have a highly volatile situation with a highly agitated subject who must be placed under arrest. So number 1 is community and officer safety. Number 2 is you have to take and maintain control of that disruptive element and all of those people in it. In the area of a food court where various alliances can be struck or enemies made, you have to make a surgical extraction in order to get the problem, if you will, out of harm's way and into the next part of where we can now decide the third element and what is the best, most appropriate resolution. So, as guardians to the entire community, of course, I'm going to be looking at, with a critical eye, the rights of this woman to ensure that we did not exceed the bounds of reasonableness and the force that we are entitled to use. Force, when administered, especially when someone who's motivated not to be taken into custody, can be very ugly. That's the long and short of it. It's nothing like you've seen scripted on a movie. There's no referee. There's no tapping out. You do what you can within the legal parameters of the law to use only that amount of force which is necessary to gain and maintain control. And as you may notice, once in fact, when the subject was ultimately handcuffed, so too did the commensurate level of force. You cannot exceed the use of force, because to do so, frankly, isn't an appropriate use of force. It becomes punishment. And no one's interested in using our lawful authority for that means. That's not who we are. That's not who we ever will be. Our values are to provide those sort of sense of community engagement, which, quite frankly, we're going to have to redouble our efforts in order to overcome the stigma of what this has created. I'm also a guardian to the officers of the Madison Police Department. I have an obligation to see that they go home each and every night to their family and loved ones. I made that commitment to them when they were hired, and I made that commitment to their families when they graduate. And nothing's going to deter that mission, and they are certainly accorded the same fundamental fairness and rights of due process as any criminal defendant would be. So In spite of some who would say, you know, again, asking me, directing me to basically violate basic tenets of employer law and fundamental due process, these processes will take some time, and we want to get it right. And so I hope people will bear with us as that process moves forward.
Any questions for the chief or for Officer Masterson?
How many times was the circuit completed with regard to this suspect?
We're not going to get into any of those nuances because those are still going to be looked at on the DVD and reduced to the master trainers to be able to count that and to be able to look at the reactions, the language that was used in conjunction with it, and all the body language that went with it in terms of the totality of the reasonableness of it.
Chief, there was a comment that she may have also placed a call to 911. Is that true?
As that is the purview of the Dane County system, I have not been given that information particularly. As a matter of fact, obviously we're still investigating for other people who may have been in the food court at the time, who may have also had cell phones available, and if those people are still willing to come forward, clearly we would like that information to make this as robust and as comprehensive investigation as we can.
Chief, is there going to be video, surveillance video from the food court, do you know?
Well, actually, as you may recall, going back to last December, much to my chagrin, the West Towne and East Towne malls do not have fixed cameras at this time. There might be some individual stores that have a very localized or focalized camera, but they don't have those public or common space cameras that we are hoping that they will incentivize themselves to get.
Was the knife on Laird when it was recovered, or was the knife recovered?
A knife was recovered. I don't know if at that point she had placed it back into her backpack or not, but it was part and parcel of the elements of DC while armed, disorderly conduct while armed. It was inferred and it was displayed.
Is there any exterior video, any other video beyond the one that's been out?
Well, I'm certain that our investigators in the East District will be looking and combing for all of those things, but for the most part, the malls are fairly derelict in having those ports of entry, ports of exit, and common food court areas. It's something, obviously, in light of all the active shooting that we've seen taking place throughout our country, that we are hoping that this will create yet another catalyst. We had that unfortunate event about the week before Christmas last year where the cameras would have been hugely beneficial to us because we had real problems getting witnesses to come forward or even our victim to cooperate. The camera would have been an excellent visual enhancer in terms of prosecuting someone.
Who are the individuals who will be in charge of the internal administrative review in your office and in Sheriff Mahoney's?
Well, we have a standing team, and we can get that to you through Joel for the personnel names. I'm still waiting from the sheriff to see who he's designated because he has a few master instructors in this domain, and so I can't speak to exactly who he's designating yet.
You've said you won't release the name of the responding officers at this point, but can you say whether there's a complaint, any complaints against the officer who deployed the taser yesterday?
I would guess I would have to defer to Joel again to work with internal affairs. I'm not familiar with their jackets in terms of that.
Both of them have been honored for life-saving in the past, but I'd have to check with professional standards to see if there's other items there. That's something they would maintain.
Thank you.
Did any police officers enter the food court, or was...
Well, subsequently many did in order to canvass the area for witnesses, other victims, any other people that might have had technology that they were running. So yes, we had a number of officers who went in and tried to continue to look at where these moving crime scenes may have reflected some positive yield.
So there's a 9-second segment of the video in which the taser is apparently being deployed. You can hear the sound. And during this time, the individual is given a series of commands. Put your hands behind your back. Put your hands behind your back. Get your hands behind your back. Do it now. Get your hands behind your back. Do it now. And throughout this exchange, during the individual's hands were apparently not only behind her back, but being secured by another officer. What could this citizen have done to keep from being tasered when the only command she was being given was one that she was apparently complying with?
Stop resisting. Stop
Why not ask
resisting.
her to do that?
Well, I'm sure they did do that inside because I see in the reports that they instructed her all the way through.
But not while they were tasing her on the ground. They were saying something she was
You're
already-
again taking a snapshot out of a moving picture, and that doesn't provide context of preamble.
Chief, I know you mentioned one of the officers is on workman's comp, but will they be back on the streets anytime soon as this investigation takes place?
Well, again, there's of course the two different needs there. First and foremost is obviously I'm concerned about his back. Back's can be a tricky thing, and so at this point the doctor said no work for at least 3 days, but that is going to coincide then with the fact that I want the community to know that we're doing everything in our parts to marshal an investigation in a timely fashion. And owing to the threats that have been received, I'm not anxious to put them back into the field until we can get a little bit more closure on where we're going with the administrative review.
Do you have any details about what the knife looks like? Is it a pocket knife or a...
I don't have that specific information. I don't know if someone from the East District can work through Joel and give you a better understanding. You can put that on your
I've
list.
read some of the reports that refer to it as a folding knife, but I can't really give you much more of a description other than that.
Did you know if she's still being held in jail and if there has, what the bail amount has been set at or any of those details?
Well, and again, she might, with some luck today yet, still get before a magistrate. I'd have to check over there, but just to be clear, anytime in the state of Wisconsin you're charged with a misdemeanor, every misdemeanor has a cash bond amount. Whether you have 1 felony or whether you have 12 felonies, a felony means no bail. You stay in jail until such time as the intake judge determines what the threshold should be conditional to your release. My sense is, again, if I had to go on the basis of what the family was telling me last night, this is her first negative adverse consequence with the police. She has ties to the community. She's certainly not a flight risk. She's been recently gainfully employed. My sense is that that's a very low bar in terms of risk to the community or flight, so I would assume that she will get a very favorable bail hearing.
Have witnesses been contacted, or do you know if there's any connection between those taking the video and the individual who's been arrested?
That's still being worked on because obviously I don't know who was the original originator of the thing that went viral on Facebook. I don't know if there's a nexus or a personal relationship, if at all, between that individual as well as the defendant in this matter. Some of the people who witnessed or were a part of the sort of alleged theft all knew each other. So the person who was theoretically the victim of a phone theft knew the person that she was contacting at the food court specifically and deduced that he had stolen her phone. So they have a sort of a loose relationship of understanding and familiarization with one another. No one's a stranger to each other in that context.
Mm-hmm. Would you also look to any sort of, de-escalation techniques that are taught to officers at all? I know there was some talk of that after the Tony Robinson shooting. I'm just kind of curious.
Well, of course, it's going to each set of facts is going to be unique unto itself, as well as what is the weapon of choice, right? So, because if someone has a handgun, obviously, my distance of space or my cover that I will choose will be something definitively different than what it might be for an edged weapon. So those are very unique unto themselves, and they're going to have to look at the totality of what they could have done. The other thing is that, quite frankly, if someone is animated and is still overtly threatening others, we have an obligation to restore order. We can't just, in that case, retreat and buy time or create distance. We have to go hands-on in order to bring someone like that back into control. So.
Was there any other conflicts during the arrest with maybe, say, some friends or anyone else that was in the food court or in the
Well, conflicts that I can't speak to except to say that no one else contiguous to that was placed under arrest or has any pending charges.
Chief, you mentioned you'll have to double your efforts in order to reduce this stigma. What is something you want the community to know, and what are those efforts that you
Well, I think, again, sort of reeling people in, I think that there is a tendency at times, owing to sort of the media depictions of the relationships of police and citizens, to presume erroneously that most of those relationships are predicated on fear, on the threat of violence, or on the use of force. And as I said sort of earlier, to contextualize, when you have over 15,000 calls a month and less than 0.25 involve anybody laying a glove on anybody beyond handcuffing, I think that speaks to the reality of what those engagements look like, and that is that they are peaceful encounters without incident.
How does this affect, or incidents like this that are high profile affect recruiting for?
Anything that has a deleterious effect on community relations is going to have a dour impact on recruiting. I mean, why would anybody in their right mind say, ooh, pick me, I want to sign up for the group that takes people's rights away or that abuses people? Of course not. That's not an image we ever want to be associated with. And that's not who we are. I think that our values are such that we pride ourselves in community policing, and community policing means you have to start with partnerships. My biggest concern is you can't develop authentic partnerships unless the other partner trusts you. So that's where the problem becomes for me, is that we can't take our community policing initiatives to the next level unless we can work through, have a dialogue, and have a transparent understanding of what the police can or can't do, and similarly, what citizens should know as a result of their attendant behavior.
Does the attention to this change your mind about whether the council was right to fund the oversight committee?
Well, I think, like I said, that ship has sailed. 19-1 is sort of a butt kicking. It's pretty clear that the community feels, as they speak, that this is a priority. It is worthy of the dollars that have been allocated, and we will embrace that. And for some, I'm sure it will be very vindicating to say exactly what we said. And those can have that can have that effect. But again, is this a moment or time, or is it a defining moment? I would like to believe it's a moment in time. So whether the study was or wasn't going to take place doesn't mean that that's the narrative that's going to be ultimately placed on the MPD and our commitment to community. Or at least I hope it isn't.
Is there anything you can do right now to repair the relationship with the African American community that seems to have been split by this video becoming so viral?
Well, first, you don't duck anybody's calls. You don't duck anybody's criticisms. You come to understand where they're coming from, and they have constituency bases that feel historical mistrust, with good reason, towards institutional policing, as well as the events of recent events, including Madison, that compound those feelings. I understand that. There isn't a time when I haven't, at moment's notice, called friends like Dr. Floyd Rose of 100 Black Men. I've talked to Dr. Ruben Anthony, Urban League. We've reached out to Greg Jones, NAACP. We routinely try to make those engagements occur proactively, and not only in response to this, but it is reassuring at many levels when, and I think it's a compliment to citizens advocates in Madison, because on my way home from council, when I can get a call from Michael Johnson, a call from Ruben Anthony, I ultimately got a call from Floyd Rose. I get a call from 3 alders. Everybody is concerned about, Chief, do you know what this looks like? It looks like hell. And so literally, by the time I got to the west side, I was anxious to try to fire up this link on my iPad, because these are people who are from normal walks of life, people I have inclined and accept as reasonable and respectable. So when their sensibilities are offended, of course I have to take knowledge of that, and I have to own that, and I think our officers understand the sensitivities of that.
So what did you think when you reviewed the video?
Well, what I think, as I said, first of all, because I'm ultimately going to be a part of whatever sanctions may occur, whenever something particularly high profile like this, I looked at it for the purposes of the once over to have a working understanding and knowledge of what people were talking about, and then I never look at it again, because now I'm going to defer to those people who will evaluate it, take it apart frame by frame, minute by minute, from the beginning of the call to the point where incarceration is occurring. And that review, to me, is much more comprehensive and objectively based than me trying to look at the nuances of a moving snapshot in the context of a 15-minute call. I do understand that there are a number of versions floating around. One's sort of the Reader's Digest version of 1.5 minutes. One's a lengthier at 6 minutes. Obviously, for me, more is better. So the more context I can get, the better appreciation I will have for the holistic dynamic of what occurred, as opposed just to the moment of the most contentious hands-on activity. Okay?
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Of course, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, and if anything else yet today, let me know. So thank you very much for coming. Sorry the room is so warm. Most people have had the news conference.